Hey, all, thanks for joining us in Food for Thoughts. This is Ramy.
This is Moni, and we're coming from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. I'm here in Waterloo, which is also the land of the Neutral people, and Ramy is joining us from Toronto, which is also the land of the Mississaugas.
Yeah, so we're talking, like Moni and I, about especially what's been happening with the pandemic and how it's impacted the society as a whole and in general, especially when it comes to the impact that neoliberalism has in our society and how it manifested during the pandemic. But the greater question is, although a lot of the dominant culture are experiencing this now, as we know and through our classes, a lot of marginalized communities have experienced that for so long. So our topic is going to be talking about this now. Like the collective horror of COVID-19 and the pandemic has shown how fragile the current neoliberal capitalist system is. And like global economies have stood still, confused, and unprepared, and they don't know what to do with the situation right now because they have two things that they have to think about. The first was like the stop of the spread of the COVID-19 virus, but the second is to make sure that the consumerist and expansionist dependent economy is actually having it takes on that so it won't drop and it won't be impacted, which we can reflect on the dysfunctionality of using a GDP growth rate to actually assess the growth and development of a society, which shows us over time how unhealthy that is. The wealth gap has been on expansional rise since the 1970s, increasing poverty, increasing inequity, and systemic oppression. And like all the like the welfare services have been reduced too. So we were hoping maybe we can visit like neoliberalism, and Moni's gonna continue talking about it a little bit in relation to like, okay, like, is there an alternative? Can we like find something that meets both like micro and macro kind of situation?
So Ramy was talking a little bit about GDP and how it's currently being used as almost a means to determine how advanced a country is, when in reality, that's not the case at all. So before we move on, I'm just going to give a couple of definitions so we're all on the same page. So GDP growth rate, or gross domestic product rate, is a way to measure how fast the economy of a country or a region is growing. So basically what it does is it's a rate that compares the output of the economy compared to the output of the economy in the last quarter of the country's year. So again, a lot of times when we talk about advanced countries, developed countries, we use GDP as an example, when in reality, GDP is just a way to measure the economy in a very capitalist and neoliberal way. So it doesn't say anything about the rights of people, it doesn't say anything about the oppression, the systemic institutions of a country, it doesn't say anything like that. And yet it's still kind of being used as a model to
Yeah.
determine how advanced a country is. So we also have the definition of neoliberalism here, just so that we can be clear before we keep discussing this as our topic for today. So Harvey 2007 and Mahone 2008 define neoliberalism as a theory of political economic practices based on the assumption that human well-being is best advanced by maximizing individualism, entrepreneurial freedoms, while also promoting private property rights, individual liberty, unfettered markets, competition, and free trade. So to kind of summarize that a little bit, neoliberalism is essentially a model, an economic model that supposes that human advancement, human well-being are all benefited by having very individualistic mindsets, individualistic private property ownership, which is what we've been seeing basically colonialism stem out of for like hundreds and thousands of years.
Which
Um,
create like a cycle of oppression, right?
yeah,
And we're always going through that.
absolutely. And what was really amazing that we found in the Laboro reading, which was one of the readings that we had for this week, was that neoliberalism isn't just a concept for the economy, but in reality, it actually is a system of oppression as well, because neoliberalism causes
Yeah.
oppression within societies in terms of racism, sexism, ableism, classism, homophobia, transphobia. So while it's considered to be an economic model, the reality is that when we start to value individualism,
Yeah.
private property ownership, all of these things, we're actually creating systems that oppress people that don't fall into like the top whatever percentage.
No, definitely. And even like I was thinking while you're talking, even when we're trying within that system to help people is in a format of charity, which is extremely create like a power dynamic because whoever have the funds can determine the objective of how this fund can be distributed or can be implemented within the field. So that
Mhm.
put a restraint within like want to professionalize the field of us being there for each other. So you're creating a nonprofit kind of situation, but in the same time it creates the aspect of we're always dependent on that money and on those folks that are in power, so it creates like a limitation to any kind of forms of growth, which I guess we can talk more about and later on. But like for me, what I appreciate, let's say through our like discussion that we've had actually in last term and this term, how like the aspect of overcoming like the cycle of oppression does not just mean for us to try to find a way to help people, but rather how can we find a way to overcome the micro oppression as well as the macro oppressions that are
Mhm.
happening and find systems that meet both those needs, the micro like is that from a community base or from a racial group, a racialized group that's going through, let's say, that kind of oppression, but also how can we implement it within, let's say, the system, whether it was the neoliberal system or the government and all that. And like it have been like a few people in our fields, actually in community psychology, liberation psychology, a lot of people in social movements on the field, on the ground, they're trying to find alternative, like one systems, processes, and measurement tools. And it is extremely important to have that. But
Mhm.
I often see it like either from a micro perspective, from a macro perspective, just like policy rather than relationship to and the process, or from a theoretical perspective, like someone coming
Mhm.
and with that kind of idea.
Mhm. And
Actually,
it's a really tricky
yeah,
balance too. Yeah,
exactly.
and yeah, something that was really interesting from the Laboro reading was basically saying that like while we're still operating in this neoliberal like system that is being built, like this is our
Yeah,
reality right now. There's a really good quote from the reading that says oppressed people eventually muster the force to oppose their oppressors. Many of
yeah,
them only continue to do so until they become oppressors themselves, and how it's really vital for the public to be aware of this in order to prevent people from relapsing into this complacency and perpetuating oppression in their own community.
definitely.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful because that's what's
Mhm.
happening. Like no matter what we do, like like I was checking this. There's something called the donut economy,
Mhm.
and it's like the aspect of how dysfunctional, let's say, what we use currently as a GDP growth rate and how harmful it is. And Kate Rayworth, I think
Mhm.
her name
Yeah.
is, like she was suggesting that we need to overcome this limiting and like primitive approach to assessing the community and the government or the society's health to moving to a much more sustainable and equitable and ethical one, which focuses actually on like a donut. And that's why it was called like a donut. And it looks on how environmental sustainable the things, the policy is, or the implementation of it is to like the environment, how much like let's say systemic racism there is there equity, if there's like human rights, how much there is, let's say for example, things related to even freedom of speech in that sense, or how healthy the community is. So it
Mhm.
goes to all those things that community psychology tries to visit and go in depth into and use it from a holistic kind of perspective. So sure, we need like some kind of growth measurement to see how well we're doing on a scale, but in the same time it needs to be equitable, that is representing, let's say, the marginalized folks also, which Kate tries to do. And I
Mhm.
think it moved from theoretical to like an actual practical is by in 2020 actually Amsterdam is trying to implement that within their own cities.
Mhm.
So which is interesting to see how it's going to be applied and how can we like can it change and all that. uh,
And something that I really loved about donut economy was that the mayor of Amsterdam had a really funny quote that stuck out to me. So she said, "The donut economy model is not just a hippie way of looking at the world." And she
yeah,
said this in response to the housing crisis that's happening in Amsterdam right now.
yeah,
And I really like this quote because a lot of times when we hear it in like neoliberal capitalist perspectives, how it's like all in it's just an imaginative theoretical model. It's like a hippie way of thinking. It's like it's never going to go anywhere, when in reality, like, this is an intervention that is actually in the process of being implemented. Like, it is being implemented in Amsterdam, and I know that they want to expand to all of the Netherlands as well, so it's not even just going to be municipal, it's going to be national.
And that's the trick about like finding a ripple effect. Like we're not gonna find a solution immediately from a perspective of like, oh, that's the solution and everyone like needs to embrace it and apply it. Like it needs to build trust, it needs to build the momentum, it needs to see how practical it is. Although we're strong believers, let's say, in decolonization and racial justice and a lot of situation abolishment, but in order to do so we need systems to replace them,
Hmm.
because no matter how willing we are and good intentioned we are, at the end of the day we live in such a big society. So what could work for one group and
Hmm.
what could work for, let's say, a network of people does not mean that's going to work for like the bigger scale. So how can we develop those systems that would work for smaller groups and make sure that they're not being marginalized and oppressed, but in the
Hmm.
same time that could work on a larger scale, because we are on a global we're in globalization, whether we want that or not. It's not going
Hmm.
anywhere. More
Hmm.
countries are creating unions, more countries are creating like all those kind of alliances. So then the question is, how can we sure overcome this imperial and expansionist kind of methodology of doing things, but also how can we accept and guide it and steer it in a way that is equitable to the
Hmm.
people that have been marginalized historically.
Hmm.
So,
And
which
I
is
think
a
that's
good
why the
question.
donut economy is so exciting, because I think it's like
Yeah,
an example that is like actually being implemented. Because another example that we were discussing was mutual aid, and how
yeah,
mutual aid is something that has existed in communities for a very, very long time.
it has.
So
Yeah,
yeah, mutual aid being defined as when people themselves get together to meet each other's basic survival needs, with a shared understanding that the system that they live in, so neoliberal system, capitalist system, like
definitely.
oppression based systems, are not going to meet our needs, and we have to do it together right now.
Yeah.
And it's funny because a lot of times like mutual aid fails as like a long-term system, but what a lot of people fail to understand is that the reason that it fails is because it's being done in a neoliberalist capitalist system, in a colonial
So,
system.
how would you differentiate it from a charity or not nonprofit, for example?
So one of the readings that we actually shared to go alongside this is a really amazing resource about what mutual aid is and how it differentiates itself from charity. So
Yeah,
charity as a concept only really exists in a capitalist neoliberal system where there is a hierarchy. So the whole point of mutual aid is that it's supposed to be non-hierarchical, versus charity, which basically says like, oh, rich people are giving a little bit to the poor to make themselves feel better, with a lot of strings attached. So, oh, you're homeless but you do drugs, you're not worthy of charity. Oh, you're a single mom who got pregnant because of XYZ, you're not worthy of charity. So it's it's like very much it comes with strings,
yeah,
and it fails to acknowledge how poverty is a result of capitalism, a result of neoliberalism, and very clearly affects people of color, women, racialized
yeah.
women, trans racialized women the most. It's not a coincidence that when we talk about who's the most in need of charity are like these most oppressed groups. It's because like the system was built like that. So mutual aid differentiates itself from that because it's basically says that like, we're going to acknowledge the systems of power that we're in, and we're going to come together as a community rather than like, oh, the rich give this much a year so that they can feel better or put it on their taxes.
Which is like, well, what like I get stuck with often. It's like all these interventions and all these movements that are happening, they're extremely important, but that we're always and every single time, and that's where my frustration and like anger comes in. It's like we're always going to be bound to neoliberalism. We're always going to be
Hmm.
bound, at least for the time being. I
Hmm.
don't want to say forever, for the next at least few decades,
Hmm.
as I see, until we truly overcome that system of, let's say, structural hierarchical kind of
Hmm.
system. So then the question is, how can we overcome that? We have all those, let's say, like donut economy and mutual aid, and a lot of more kind of amazing work that's being done through social movements, local organizers, and all that kind of stuff. but then we're always going to be bound to like either government policy or the economic policies that are put in place that are limiting. Because let's say, like you're saying, like mutual aid, for example, within their own circle, and like I think also like back in the day, the Black Panther,
Mm.
pardon me, the Black Panther Party did so, and they were really successful, and like their community health like was on the rise. But then the FBI came and like started attacking and started dismantling like the party.
Mhm.
So you always have someone trying to like either directly and explicitly trying to dismantle you, or like through like the hidden implicit policies or like
Mm.
implicit biases that are hidden but yet they're clear for community of colors and marginalized and racialized
Mhm.
communities.
Yeah,
So
and generally speaking,
yeah,
also like neoliberal systems use oppression as a tool to ensure that other interventions always fail, which is, I think, which is like
definitely.
very frustrating.
But you know, I think if we continue as we are, like let's say the mutual aid, like creating a network of mutual aid, like in New York, I think I was reading there's community gardens, network
Mhm.
of community gardens that feed local people that are experiencing poverty, whether it
Mhm.
was people that are experiencing homelessness or those that cannot meet ends meets, for example.
Mhm.
And what they're doing is it's like 500 group of local people, or like local gardens, and
Gardens,
they're
yeah.
working really well together.
Mhm.
And they're doing it within, let's say, the neoliberal. But I feel, although that still has its limitation, but it can, like, hopefully with the donut economy, with let's say Amsterdam, can create a ripple effect for
Mhm.
later on and to move forward. What
Mhm.
do you think? Like, how? What usually are your thoughts around like this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting to see that it's starting to ripple. I think
Yeah,
it can be really frustrating because even locally, like the defund Hamilton Police Service movement, like was a great example of mutual aid, of people coming together to feed each other and house each other, and then the city just came and literally tore it all down. Like
yeah,
all of that work tore it all down. So again, it's really frustrating because like these are things that could be successful, and like we want to see be successful, but there's so many systems working against us and working against communities to prove that it can't be done. But one thing that I think was really exciting, the Laboro text had a really positive spin. Like it had a very inspirational spin, and it said, you know, if we can come together as a community, we can educate everyone on what neoliberalism is and how it is not the fundamental truth of society, and how it doesn't have to be our future. Like we can make positive change. And I think that was really, really exciting and pretty heartwarming and wholesome.
so maybe what we can do then from here, leave it to the class to discuss like the pros and cons of like mutual aid and donut economy.
Hmm.
We shared like prior to this podcast some material that you can check,
Hmm.
and some of them have like definitions concerning what we're talking about and some examples of what we're talking about. So we
Hmm.
hope that you were able to check them out.
Hmm. As well as
Uh,
the handout, which had a creative lens, but had like a very inspirational spin
yeah,
to it, and like hopefully expanded everyone's thoughts
exactly.
about this. Yeah.
So let's do that then. Like class, we're talking to you right now, even we talked from the past, but here we are. So let's divide into two groups. One group that will talk about mutual aid, and the other about the donut economy, and talk about the pro and cons about them, how feasible they are, and how can we, let's say, envision them within our like future as a whole. Or if you have
Hmm.
alternative, let's say,
Hmm.
intervention or concepts that we'd like to share,
Hmm.
it will be great. Like each one of you,
Hmm.
we're gonna have like 10 minutes to discuss it in your own smaller groups, but then we can come back to the bigger bubble and we can talk with each other, I guess.
And feel
Yeah,
free to also think of different critiques. If maybe
exactly.
like what could or couldn't work in the community that we're all part of, or in the region that we're all a part of. And then we'll bring that all together and see maybe what we can think of as a collective future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks
Well,
for listening. We can't
yeah.
wait to interact with you in the present day when you're watching this. This is Moni signing off.
And this is Rami, and you are with Food for Thoughts.